Over the last lectures, we had a lot of deep dives into how components work under the hood, how they are created and updated, and how you can control updates and hook. And with that, I don't mean React hooks, but tap into different points during the update and creation cycle to execute your own code, both in functional components with the use effect hook and in class-based components with the different lifecycle hooks we implemented there. Now there is more to React components that I want to cover, and I want to dive into something you'll see throughout this course. I want to dive into that thing that I mentioned, that you have to always return just one JSX element inside of a component. Now, that JSX element can contain other JSX elements, like here in the person component, but you must only have one root JSX element, be that another component or a normal HTML element. So I'm not allowed, for example, to have a adjacent div here. So if I try to return this, and of course it does not matter if that's a div or a h1 tag or anything like that, then I get an error. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So I'm basically not allowed to return adjacent JSX elements like this on a root level. So inside of that div, so these elements here, there it's okay that they're adjacent, but the root element I'm returning in this component or in any place where I need to return JSX has to be one single element with as many children as you want. Now, this is not entirely true though, because if you have a look at the persons component, there we actually return an array of persons, right? So that's not one single element, it's an array. Now, technically, an array, of course, still is one object, but with multiple elements in there. And indeed, React does allow us to return an array of adjacent elements as long as all the items in there have a key. And that key is required so that React can efficiently update and reorder these elements as it might be required by your app. So where can we see this in action? Well, let's go back to the person component, so a single person. And there we have that div with our CSS class. And of course, that div is theoretically something I want here. I want to have that wrapping container which applies a style. But for now, let's temporarily remove it. And therefore, of course, this is invalid because now we have adjacent elements. But let's now not return them like this, but let's wrap them in square brackets. So here I will return my JSX elements in an array. Now, this might look strange, but remember, JSX is just syntactic sugar for React create element. So in the end, we're just returning a couple of calls to React create element here, or the results of these calls to be precise. Hence, we need to separate these items with commas after each of them, right? So a comma after the paragraph, a comma after this paragraph, and then, well, this is the last element. So this is now an array of elements, and if I now save that, actually, if I click toggle persons, it works, but I'm getting a warning regarding that key. And that is what I mentioned. You should add a key here. Well, for that, we can simply add a key on these elements. And here, we're not generating the key dynamically. We're not extracting a unique value from anywhere. You can, of course, assign your own unique value, like I1 for item 1, or whatever you want. Any identifier that you simply don't repeat. That's the only important thing. Each key here should be unique in that array. So now I have 3 different keys, and that means that this now works without any issue, without any warning, and in exactly the same way as before. The only difference is the missing styling, because that div we had around our elements, that actually was not just there to have a root level element, it did provide some useful styling. But that is okay here, because I want to show you this concept of adjacent elements, because later in this course, and also in the course project of this course, we will actually have use cases and scenarios where we want to have multiple top-level elements sit next to each other, and having to introduce an extra wrapping div or a section just because React forces us when we don't technically need it from a HTML or a CSS point of view. That is a bit of redundancy that we don't want to add to our app. And therefore, it's important to know that if you don't technically need a wrapping element for styling or structural reasons, then you can avoid it by using an array. But this is not even the only way of doing it. You can, of course, create such an array, but it's a bit inconvenient. You have to wrap this in square brackets, you have to assign the key, and so on. So that is not really that great. How else could you do that besides using an array? Well, this approach might look a bit hacky at first, but it's perfectly fine and actually built into React, as you will learn. You can create a wrapping component that does not render any actual HTML code, but that simply is there to fulfill React's requirement of having a wrapping component. And for this, I'll create a new folder, which I'll name HOC, which stands for Higher Order Component. And we'll dive deeper into higher order components in the next lectures. They are basically components that wrap other components. And in there, I will create a new file, which I will name aux.js for auxiliary. And side note for Windows users, their aux.js will not work. So on Windows, you should name this auxiliary.js, simply because aux is a reserved word or name on Windows systems. On Linux and Mac, this is no problem. Now, how does this aux component look like? First of all, I import React from React. That is important. And then I have my const, which I'll name aux, which gets props, and that's the interesting thing, will only return props children here. Children is a special property that simply outputs whatever gets entered between the opening and closing tag of this component. So then I export my aux component here as the default, and now we can import this into the person component. So let's import aux with a capital A from, and now let's go all the way up to the higher order component folder and import aux. And now we can use aux like a regular JSX element to wrap all the other JSX code here. Simply like this. Now, that might look very strange at first because, of course, the aux component doesn't do anything, but as you can see, it works. It renders our content. It's basically an empty wrapper using that special children property, which React reserves for us. So that really is a reserved property name that React reserves for us, and children will always refer to the content between the opening and closing tag of your component. So in this case, children will refer to all this content, and all the aux component does is it outputs that content. Now you might argue, but isn't this a set of adjacent elements in this place then? Well, that is the hard thing to wrap your head around. It kind of is, you could say, but actually it isn't, because the requirement of having this wrapping top-level element is a pure technical one from a JavaScript point of view, that you must only return one expression, and that is what we're doing here. Because you must never forget that these JSX elements are always calls to React create element. And in a return statement, you couldn't return multiple React create element calls like this next to each other. And therefore, you can't do this either for JSX code. But the moment you wrap this with one React create element call, so to say, this works. And then here in the aux component, you're just returning an input. So technically, from a JavaScript point of view, that is fine. We're only returning one expression here. So it can be tricky to wrap your head around. It is a pure JavaScript thing here, or it's actually the case in most programming languages. You must only return one expression, and here it's one expression now, and here it's now one expression. Now, as a side note, in the aux component, we now don't even need the React import here because we're not using any JSX in here, so we're not implicitly using React create element, and therefore this works even if you remove that import.